Hello.
Yeah, so I think we are ready to run. Yeah, just giving it like 2 more minutes for a few people, more people to come in back in from lunch, and then we kick it off.
Perfect. I will give them 2 more minutes to filter in.
Do you want to start sharing your screen now, or you share later?
I will do that. Yep.
Perfect. Yeah, can see your slides. Good.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to begin here. I'm not hearing you too well, so hopefully this will work regardless. Yeah, just let me know if everybody can hear me, and feel free to pop messages into the chat. Yeah. Okay. So welcome to my little presentation on tech for community mapping, an end-to-end approach. And this is, basically, this is all about how do we do, how do we create impact from community mapping? And I'm going to get into some details here in tools. And I do apologize that I'm not able to be there in person. I really wanted to actually do some live demos of a bunch of fun tools with you all, but we're going to have to make do with a remote connection. So what are the steps? If you're talking about community mapping, and what I mean by community mapping is mapping done by local people with local resources in places like Cameroon. And I've been working for more than 20 years now, all over Africa and Asia and a little bit of South and Central America. And basically, these are places where the normal tools for mapping don't work too well. And so when I say community mapping, I'm basically talking about mapping that communities can do on their own with all of their own tools. And I'll talk about what that means in a moment. But first of all, let's just actually analyze what the steps are. So I always envision it as kind of a layer cake. At the bottom, there's actually sensory data. That's usually imagery. And for those of us who, work in OpenStreetMap a lot, we're very much accustomed to a satellite image as a base map. But of course, there's all kinds of other basically sensory data that we might use for mapping. Certainly GPS traces. In the very early days of OpenStreetMap, the very first edits weren't done from satellite imagery. They were done from GPS imagery. People were using, Garmin GPSs and running around cities to figure out where the streets were and creating the map based on, GPS data. But this is still sensor data. When I mean sensor data, I mean it's images, it's traces, it's raw information about the world. It's not drawn features. And the kinds of things we would use nowadays are, of course, obviously satellite imagery, aerial imagery, drone imagery, ground-based imagery. We have, increasingly people using sort of mapillary style cameras or GoPro style cameras from the ground, and we can create data that you can actually use as base data for creating maps from that. And of course GNSS data, or even importing scanned paper maps and that kind of thing. So that's, again, raw, messy, usually raster data from the world. And then the second layer is turning those into representations. You're digitizing the information into the map. And when most people think about doing open mapping, that's what they think about. Going to a Mapathon or participating in a mapping campaign using the tasking manager or Geosm. And so people will be, looking at whatever the base data is and clicking on it. So, since the dawn of OpenStreetMap, and as long as I've been involved, the main activity that we do is we have a mapping campaign. We have a place that we want mapped. We have some base data, usually some satellite imagery. We put a project in the hot tasking manager, and then we manually, using ID editor or Geosm, we point and click on our laptop or our desktop computer using a mouse. That's manual digitization. Increasingly, however, there's AI digitization. So there are at the moment in OpenStreetMap approximately 575 million building footprints. And the Microsoft and Google AI building footprints that have recently been released are actually closer to 1.2 billion. So quite a lot more buildings. The quality is a different question. But certainly the idea of digitization, converting raw data into actual features, lines and polygons and points, or even 3D volumes, shapes that represent things on the ground. That's been a manual process, but increasingly it's becoming automated, and we're using AI for that. And something that we have to consider thinking about is also three-dimensional digitization. There's a wonderful project that's OSM Japan is doing, where they're actually creating digital twins of the cities. And if you look at some of the commercial maps, so you look at Google Earth or Google Maps in Manhattan or San Francisco, and the really highly technically central places, they're actually starting to be 3D now. So when we talk about digitizing into a map, it's not just points and lines and polygons. There's also eventually shapes. Nevertheless, that step 2 really is, it's digitizing into representative features. It's geometry. You take all of this messy information from the world and you turn it into a line, a point, a polygon, or a shape. And the third layer in this is adding local knowledge. What good is a polygon for a building if you don't know what's in it, what the address is? What good is a line for a road if you don't know if it's a one-way or if it's two-way, or how many lanes it is, or whether it's appropriate for vehicle traffic or foot traffic? And in our open mapping parlance, we usually talk about that as being tagging. So we have an example here in this image of amenity equals restaurant and cuisine equals African. So you would actually take these representative geometrical features from layer 2 and you actually add information to them. And at the very simplest level, this information might be as little as an address. What's the number on each building? It might be as detailed as a census. You might imagine somebody actually adding attributes to a building or another feature that are literally a long-form census. You're asking questions about who lives in the house or what kind of business is in there, a huge amount of detail. Nevertheless, it really is, in my way of thinking, adding local knowledge, adding attributes is one step. You start with the sensory data, you go to the digitization of the features, and then you start adding attributes, information, local knowledge to those features. In the next layer, these are the last 2 layers in my schema here, making information accessible. So, all right, there's a map. What do you do with it? What do people most often interact with? Probably the most common interaction with a map that people have nowadays is a mobile map. And I'm sad to say it's usually not OpenStreetMap or an open map that they're interacting with. It's most often actually Google Map, where they're using it to navigate. So you're driving somewhere, you're walking somewhere, you're riding your bike or your motorcycle somewhere. You pull open your mobile device, you look at where you are, you do a search for where you're going, and you use that to navigate. Of course, there's much more to it than that. Obviously, in the old days, what we used were static maps. You'd have a printed PDF. My first, most critical maps were actually not maps, or data products weren't maps, they were gazetteers. It was a booklet that you would use in a health center that would allow you to look up someone's location of origin. A gazetteer is a kind of booklet that's an index of all of the places. So somebody would come to a health center and they'd be ill, and you'd want to make sure that you could trace the contacts of anybody else who might have that disease. So you would say, well, what province are you from? And within that province, what district? And you'd be looking this up in a little booklet called a gazetteer. What district are you in within that district? What section within that section? What village within that village? What block? And that's how you would actually, from someone's verbal description of where they come from, you'd be able to get some coordinates so you could send someone to do public health control. So static things can include a PDF map or a gazetteer. Mobile maps include things like Google Maps, and of course they also could include some of the OpenStreetMap based applications like Apple Maps or TomTom. So I think probably most people in this auditorium know that when you're interacting with Apple Maps or TomTom Maps, which are also very common maps, the data that's underneath is actually OpenStreetMap for the most part. And that brings me to an interesting reflection, which is that map data APIs are another kind of way to make information accessible. Rather than making information accessible directly to individuals, you make it accessible to developers. So I wonder if there's a rideshare company in Cameroon, because I know where I'm living right now in Rwanda, there's a rideshare company called Cabs. It's very much like Uber. So Uber is, the giant American rideshare company. And it looked like it was going to dominate the entire world. And when it failed to do so, a lot of countries have their own little rideshare company. In Bangladesh and Nepal, where in Nepal I've spent a lot of time and done a lot of work, there's a rideshare company called Mapathon. And here in Rwanda, there's a rideshare company called Cabs. Now, these companies use an application to deploy drivers or deliver food to people or whatever. And they're using a map in the background. And what's that map? Almost invariably, it's the Google Maps API. Now, this is interesting because if there was an API, something like the Google API that really exposed to developers like these, individual country rideshare companies, a way to use open data instead of Google data, that could be, another way that we'd be making information accessible to people. So if somebody wants to put into the comments, if in their country there's a rideshare company that uses Google Maps in the background, or if there's another, important use case where people are using something that's not open maps in the background, please put that into the comments. That'd be interesting to hear about. And the fifth layer here is supporting partners to achieve impact. And that really, to me, means more than just making data accessible. I think it's a big fallacy in the humanitarian mapping world that we imagine we will create a bunch of data, we will make this data available to the world, and somebody will use it and change the world and create impact. Well, maybe they will and maybe they won't. I think it's not a safe assumption that this will actually work without us actually getting involved. So I see the fifth layer after you've, if you go back to step one, you have sensor data about the world. In step two, you digitize it. In step three, you add some local knowledge or attributes to it. In step four, you make it available to people. Well, step five, actually save some lives or improve some lives or create some development or create a better world with it. And for that, I believe what we need to do is have domain level expertise. We need, as a mapping community, to understand things like public health and environmental protection and climate change resilience and disaster risk reduction and even pizza delivery or rideshare, understanding how companies can use this, not because necessarily our goal is to help companies make money, but because the more people interact with the map, the more the map becomes part of the DNA of the community, and the more people can use it for good as well. So, companies using map data results in more and better map data in many cases. And the example we've got on the bottom of here of this image is we used map data for a small community in northeastern Brazil that was faced with terrible flood risk to actually improve both their advocacy for better management of the water to the government and other stakeholders, as well as to actually create their own resilience, actually changing the way they were building their houses and managing their land to account for flood risk. So there's my 5-layer cake: sensory-based data, digitization, attributes, data accessibility, operational support. Now, where are the gaps? Now, I'm sure many of you know that, if we talk about that first layer, that earlier this year, Maxar, formerly Digital Globe, that used to provide access to fairly high quality imagery, satellite imagery for digitization, they withdrew the permission for OpenStreetMap contributors to use their imagery for digitization. So from 2012, we were allowed to use Bing imagery. And a few years later, we got access to the Maxar imagery. And for many years, we got accustomed to having pretty high resolution satellite imagery. And in March of this year, that was pulled. And that has been, in my experience, kind of a slow burn catastrophe in the whole open mapping sector, wherein we not only can we not digitize new areas using high resolution imagery, we can't even validate the areas that we've already done, because we don't have access to that imagery to check, what was it done from? It was done from the Maxar imagery. We can't see that anymore unless we actually purchase it, or maybe in certain disasters, Maxar actually allows that imagery to be used freely on a case-by-case basis. During the earthquake in Morocco, for example, they released a bunch of open data, but the basic fundamental layer has been withdrawn. So what are the gaps in sensory-based data? We created a dependency on corporate responsibility, corporate social responsibility, donated imagery. And when it was pulled, we find ourselves in a terrible situation because we didn't invest in enough local imagery. Okay, and digitization, where are the gaps? I don't think that's the worst one. As I said, since the beginning of my involvement in OpenStreetMap in 2010, this primary activity of Mapathons has been working pretty well. And there's not many places in the world where you can zoom into OpenStreetMap and not see a pretty decent looking map. That being said, the commercial maps are starting to move forward much more quickly now because they're using AI. So digitization, I would say, it's not a gap in the sense that it's something that we've been struggling with, but certainly if we want to remain relevant, we need to be looking at what's happening in other mapping worlds, and the speed and quality with which machine learning or AI, artificial intelligence algorithms, can do digitization is worth watching. And I'll talk about that in a moment. There's actually some very cool tools that we might have for that. In attributes, tagging these buildings. Well, this was, in my view, attributes was the biggest gap that we could identify about a year ago. And I'll give an example. Again, I mentioned that there are approximately 575 million buildings in OpenStreetMap today. Of those, approximately 3 million have actually been field mapped, in the sense that somebody has gone to that building with some kind of data collection tool in person and added data to it. So the adding of attributes in the field, actual observational data in person, we haven't even really meaningfully begun. If we imagine that there's approximately 2 billion buildings in the world, the estimates range between 1.5 and 3 billion. It's hard to know exactly how many buildings there are, but almost certainly more than 1.5 billion and almost certainly less than 3 billion. And we've digitized 370 or 575 million building footprints. So assuming those are of good quality, which is a big assumption, But assuming that that quality is reasonable, that means we've actually done a substantial fraction between the third and the sixth of all the buildings in the world. But of those, only 3 million have been field mapped. Only 3 million of those buildings actually have attributes that someone has been to the building and used their local knowledge or their ability to observe to add that data. That's less than 1%. Less than 1% of the buildings that we have actually digitized, let alone the buildings that actually exist in the world. And there we're talking, a fraction of a percent. So that, to me, if I talk about what are the gaps, attributes was the biggest one that I could identify about a year and a half ago. Moving on to data accessibility. Again, it gave it away in the earlier slide where I said, there's not really a good API for third-party developers to create applications that make really good use of OpenStreetMap and of open mapping. And that's a shame because it means that people in places where OpenStreetMap actually has way better data than Google, developers are creating their applications using Google Maps. So that's a gap that somebody should fix. And well, who's somebody? Well, we are somebody. We are the community. And finally, operational support. If we talk about, some of these wonderful examples like the work that was done in Brazil, in Tanzania, we have a great deal of work that's been done to support food security. So I hope my friends from Open Map Development Tanzania are in the room, because they mapped 55,000 grain mills across Tanzania in person on motorcycles to actually, go and create to support the World Food Program and understanding the food supply chains in that country and increase food security. In India, we've worked with a group called Hasiru Aqua, who are creating fish farms, allowing farmers to actually create better food supplies. And we've mapped about 200,000 ponds for them, enough to actually supply millions of people with good quality fish, good high quality protein. In operational support, it also means we should be developing more public health expertise, more environmental expertise. I know that here there are many people from Humanitarian OpenStreetMap Team's West Africa Hub, which has a tremendous expertise and focus on climate change and in the environment. And that's exactly the kind of thing that we need to be doing, is developing that domain level expertise so that we can help people make change rather than just provide data and hope someone does something with it. So where are the gaps? As again, in sensory-based data, community imagery. Sure, we could wait for the satellite companies to help us, or we could fly small drones ourselves. If we can't get permission or the technology to fly drones, we can use ground-based cameras. We can actually use ground-based cameras to create three-dimensional imagery. We should not be waiting for big companies and governments and large institutions to be providing us with base data. We should be self-sufficient as a community. In digitization, we should be looking beyond the current use of Geosm and ID editor. We don't need to be focusing on the tools that we already have to do business as usual digitization, when we know that others are actually using AI to go faster and better and increasingly actually creating features in 3D. In attributes, well, tasking for field mapping. So that's the one of the key things I'm going to talk about during my presentation here is the field mapping tasking manager. And of course, for attributes, in order to get the field mapping tasking manager working, if you want to add attributes to a building or a road, you have to have a feature for that building or road that you can actually attach those attributes to. So talking about the quality of the digitization is something I'm going to get into as well. And data accessibility, more user-facing apps, more open data, convincing some of the corporates out there to share more of their data, to share more of their tools. And again, a developer-facing API that actually allows developers in our priority countries to use open data instead of Google. In operational support, find the teams that are working on the health and the climate and the economic problems and invest and support them. Okay, I'm going to pause here to see if there are questions. So Pete and Sam, I assume that you're going to ping me if there are questions coming in the chat. I can't see the chat given my screen share. So let me just give everyone, it's been 30 minutes now. Let me give everyone just a moment for a breath and see if there are any questions so far.
In the chat, Ivan, we have one comment, not a question, from Emmanuel saying in Bolt Maps, he's seen OSM attribute data when he was searching for a pickup address, so the rideshare point.
Yes, good. Yeah, very good comment. Indeed, there are other than Google, a lot of companies that are using OpenStreetMap. Now, Bolt, of course, is a fairly large company. I would hope that the smaller companies, the companies and the communities that are actually in our communities are in the low income areas where we're working would have the ability to use that data. At the moment, when Bolt or TomTom or Apple use OpenStreetMap data, they're actually, they have entire engineering teams to use the data themselves. And for the most part, they actually build their own stacks. Now, there is a new entrant called the Overture Foundation, which I met with their CEO a couple of weeks ago in California. And the Overture Foundation explicitly intends to be developer facing. In other words, they intend to actually provide data for developers to use OpenMap data for good, but they're very United States centric. And if it's not United States, it's Western Europe and other high income countries. So I still think there's a gap for the use of OpenStreetMap and open mapping data by developers outside of the great big companies in the tech sector. So Emmanuel, thank you for that comment. Okay.
Ivan, we've got a question. We've got a question in the audience here.
Oh, please bring it.
Yeah, my question is, the features that are being mapped, such as roads, buildings, and the likes, how do we go about adding their attributes to it so that when one click on a building, one will see the attribute or the information of that building? So my question is, how do we go about it? Because it is high time we have information about a particular feature at a glance. So thank you.
I could not agree more. It is high time, as you say. So you know what? This is actually going to be the focus of the rest of what I'm going to be talking about, which is indeed, it is high time for this data to be much more complete, for there to be genuine local knowledge and attributes on these features on the map. And how do we get there? It turns out there are some issues. So let me begin with this. And I've just got a message from Pete saying, great question. Indeed, what a great question. Fantastic. So sending you all my love from Rwanda for asking the key central question here. It is high time. So right. Okay, so as you can see in my slide, in many places, the data that we have in open mapping, in OpenStreetMap and other open mapping portals looks remarkably complete. Streets, waterways, even trees have been digitized. If I zoom into the map and I see this, my automatic instinctive assumption is this is correct. Sadly, it's not always so. There are places where it's basically perfect. I don't know if anyone recognizes this area. If you look really closely at the labels, you might be able to guess.
Buckingham Palace, London.
Well done. Yes. So, indeed, there might not be a more prestigious address on the planet than Buckingham Palace. And here, in fact, pretty much every building is not only correctly digitized, but there's pretty good information attached to it. So here we have essentially the ultimate area of privilege and wealth, where somebody has invested so much thought and effort and energy into the map that it is not only complete in terms of good digitization, but actually there's attributes on almost everything. Well, now here, this is in southern Nepal, it's not so much the case. If we want to actually add proper attributes to all of the buildings in our homes rather than where King Charles lives, we actually need a polygon to be able to select and add those attributes to. Now, I have a challenge for you. And this is a challenge that basically I first realized that we needed a way to coordinate field mapping about 1.5 years ago. And the field mapping tasking manager was my sort of main thrust. The idea being, if we're going to add attributes to the rest of the world, we need to coordinate field mapping in the same way that we coordinate remote mapping. So when you go remote mapping, what do you normally do? You don't log straight into Geosm or OpenStreetMap. You log into the hot tasking manager. And in the tasking manager, what do? You select a square, a task. This is my task. There are many like it, but this one is mine. And now, in that sense, not only do you know exactly what you're responsible for, and it's fairly easy to tell when when you haven't finished or when you have finished and when it's complete. And we have a process for doing some validation where somebody looks and goes, yeah, that looks good. We're going to actually push that into OpenStreetMap. This is a way in which hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people, there are millions of people that have contributed to OpenStreetMap via the tasking manager. And by and large, we know when something's been missed. We can find areas that still need to be completed. We can find areas that need to be repaired. It's actually possible, given something like the tasking manager, to do a complete job on an entire city or country or region. Well, for field mapping, not so much. What do we use for field mapping? We use OpenDataKit or Kobo Toolbox, which is a variant of OpenDataKit. We use Everydoor, we use Street Complete, we use Vespucci. But all of these applications simply allow us to add data to one building. Just as if you were to log into Geosm and randomly choose a spot to start digitizing. That doesn't actually create good data. I mean, it creates good data for one individual structure, but it doesn't create coherent data across areas. It doesn't allow you to validate it. So the field mapping tasking manager was born out of the idea that we can do the same thing that the hot tasking manager did for Geosm for something like OpenDataKit, for ODK or Kobo Toolbox. So we built it. And now you can see a screenshot here of somebody who's actually holding a phone. And in that phone, they're within their own task, and they've got a set of buildings. So you notice there's a set of building footprints which are in red. And there's buildings across the street from it and below it that aren't in red. Why? Because that person has got one task that they're responsible for. There are 25 buildings in it. And those footprints, they're to click on them and add the attributes of each building. And in this case, they were adding the street addresses, whether it was a residential or a commercial building, how many levels were it, what material is that building, what's the roof made of, if it's a business, what type of business is it, what are they selling, exactly what from that wonderful question, thank you for that again, of like, it's high time that we actually had this information available at a glance. And so this is a tool to in fact create that information or to add that information to the map. It's local knowledge, it's done by local people, it's done in person, and it's done with locally available tools, i.e. our mobile phones. Well, what did we discover? Sadly, we were expecting every building footprint to correspond to a building. Oh my, that's not how it goes. So I have a challenge for all of you. When you go outside, when you go home, grab an OpenStreetMap application, OSMAND or Organic Maps, load it onto your phone, and go outside and try to correlate, try to see where the buildings, where your home and your neighbors' homes and the buildings around you, try to see if there's actually a single building footprint that corresponds to each one. I think I hear someone in the audience. Did I hear a comment? Let me ask a question. Has anybody tried this? Has anybody tried using OSMAND or Organic Maps or something like that to go outside and actually correlate individual building footprints to the polygons that they can see on their mobile phone screen? Not hearing anyone?
Ivan, I remember OpenMapKit as a way of doing this briefly.
Yes, in the old days, we had OpenMapKit, which allowed us to do it. OpenMapKit was a wonderful application, which sadly hasn't been maintained for a number of years. And of course, OpenMapKit actually didn't contain a way to coordinate this. It contained a way to select individual buildings and add attributes to them. It didn't actually include a way to group those buildings such that I'm responsible for these 25 buildings and you're responsible for those other 25 buildings. And so, basically OpenMapKit, which was a fork of OpenDataKit, we've now, incorporated, the OpenDataKit team, partially, with our cooperation and collaboration and inspiration. OpenDataKit team has now included that, click on a building and add attributes to ODK and Kobo Toolbox themselves. But what we're also trying to add is that tasking manager-like functionality where not only do you have the ability to choose a building, you have a set of buildings that you're responsible for. But my question here now is more about when you look at your neighborhood, and in many cases you can see that there's a lot digitized. All the roads seem to be digitized. It seems to be full of digitized buildings. It probably looks a lot like this. But if you actually go outside and try to correspond, those building footprints to your to the polygons on your phone, does it work? So a question then is, somebody trying to create those polygons that you'd be able to use, how would you digitize this area? So here is, this is a zoomed in area of a building, a couple of buildings in southern Nepal in a place called Janakpur. This is drone imagery, so it's fairly high resolution. This was taken by NAXA, which is a wonderful geospatial consultancy that we're working with, and some of you actually know them. If you're looking at this in Geosm, how would you digitize it? Maybe like that. Maybe you'd see, well, okay, there's that blue roof down below, and then there seems to be a fairly sharp line between the big white building up to the north. But what about that little triangle of white roof? Is that actually a different building? And what about that little square in the middle there? What is that? What if you were trying to digitize that from satellite imagery? But just to be clear, this is satellite imagery that we're not allowed to use. This is Google Earth imagery. So here we have a drone image of these buildings, and here we have a pretty good satellite imagery of those buildings. That's about as good as it's usually ever going to get. But what if we used imagery that we're actually allowed to use? Bing satellite imagery. There it is. Okay, how would you digitize this building now? Do you think digitizing from this imagery would allow us to create building polygons that would correspond one-to-one to structures that we could add attributes to? It turns out That's what it actually looks like if you get it right. Now, this is where we have used drone imagery. Again, this is in southern Nepal. We used drone imagery, and then we digitized from that drone imagery, and then we went in the field with the field mapping tasking manager, and we actually asked everyone, is this a building or is this two buildings? And the area that I showed you, this is how it's actually digitized. It turns out that the larger building that we tried to draw back here is roughly correct, but in fact, there's another building called the Vijaya Fancy Stores, which is actually quite visually indistinguishable from the rest of the building. And that little white triangle was, as we might have guessed, another building. And that square in the center of the building is actually an extension. It's basically another smaller story level being put on top of the building. So it turns out that even from high resolution drone imagery, it's very difficult to actually distinguish truly one building from another. And I know that there was some discussion about informal areas, aka slums, earlier on in the day. Great presentation and discussion there. And of course, in informal areas, you have tremendous numbers of overlapping roofs, so it's even more difficult to distinguish one structure from another. And so, well, how could we even get to the starting point where we can actually, in these dense urban areas, use something like the field mapping tasking manager or open data kit to select individual structures and add attributes to them? Well, there's a way. How do we get there? What tools do we have now? What tools do we need? The first thing I would like to point out is that when we use drones, when we're using, the usual drones that we use for mapping, people think of the SenseFly EB, the large, expensive, Swiss-made $18,000 drone. That's a fixed wing, and it, if it belongs to somebody locally, it's usually a large organization or it's been donated by the World Bank or something, because it's literally $18,000 US to buy the thing. And it flies and it has a camera that looks only straight down. Well, now this image here was actually created with a $700 drone of mine. It's called a Parrot Anafi. And that small drone, $700, you can fly it a couple of times, once looking straight down and once doing what's called double grid, flying sideways. Now, look closely under the bridge. Can someone confirm to me if you can see this in the auditorium? Somebody who's there in person, can you tell me if this image is visible, this moving image?
Yeah, Ivan, it's clear.
Okay, fantastic. So if you can see this, do me a favor and look under the bridge. Can you see that? Can you see the fact that the imagery of the water continues all the way under the bridge? And that's because this really inexpensive consumer-grade drone was not flying only looking down. We flew it once looking down, then we flew it again with the camera tilted 45 degrees to the side so we can see underneath structures. This is the office of, again, I hope my friends from Tanzania are in the audience, because this is in fact the office of Open Map Development Tanzania in Mikocheni in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And this was flown with the Mavic 2 Pro that belongs to OMDTZ. It's a very inexpensive drone. I think it's about $1,200. They don't make them anymore, but you can still get them. And once again, we flew this drone once looking straight down and then again looking sideways. And what you'll see now is that it's much easier to distinguish one building from another and tell the difference between one compound and another when you can tilt to the side. So my thing that I'd like you to imagine now in terms of gaps is, what if you had this in your digitization tool? What if when you're using something like Geosm, as you're looking straight down, trying to figure out where the boundaries of the building are, what if you could tilt to the side and look at the edge of the, look at the side of the building, look at the side wall of the building? You think you'd be able to do a better job of distinguishing one structure from another if you could actually see around the side? Well, I think so. And so, you know, after we did this, me and Idi Chazua, my great friend from Tanzania, sat down with a spreadsheet and figured out, you know, how much would it cost to actually generate this imagery across the entire city? And it turns out, if you're using, you know, consumer grade drones and you're using local people and providing employment to local people at, you know, decent local rates, we didn't, you know, select this for like cheap labor. We used decent rates that would be good compensation for local youth to work on. And it turns out that it's maybe 4 or 5 times as expensive as satellite imagery. The satellite imagery that, you know, somebody's paying for, we get it for free from Bing, but it's on the order of $25 a square kilometer. We can do this for on the order of $150 a square kilometer. So all of you in the audience, anybody here who is frustrated that they can't see what they're doing when they're trying to digitize, and they imagine that, you know, with locally available tools with relatively inexpensive drones, they could get this. Well, go and talk to Idi. He's there in person, and he did this with me. In fact, that might be him who's standing there next to the little white thing in the courtyard there. And imagine what we could do in terms of quality data if we were digitizing from this instead of this. And this is Bing imagery. This is what we're often actually trying to work from. So what do we need for that? I hope that some of you have become interested and are maybe thinking, whoa, maybe there is actually relatively accessible technology that will allow us to do something better. What do we really need? Well, first off, we need more open drone hardware. So I mentioned that image in Indonesia was taken with a Parrot Anafi, a $700 drone. So I still have a few of those. They were such great drones that I bought as many of them as I could. But they don't make them anymore. They haven't made them since 2019. And our dear friends at DJI, who create the Mavic drone, and they also create the Phantom 4 Pro drone, well, they've decided that we should probably use the Phantom 4 Pro, which is about $4,000 US. So the Mavics, which you can buy for, you know, you can buy a little Mavic Mini for $700. You can buy a Mavic Pro for like $1,200. They're literally disabled for mapping missions now. To do mapping, you know, this kind of thing that we did here, you need to be able to actually deploy the drone to do a specific grid pattern. And that means the drone has to be able to work with the third-party software or some kind of software that actually deploys it to fly a specific pattern. And the more recent Mavics don't support that because DJI presumably would rather we spend the $4,000 on the Phantom 4 Pro. So in fact, there's almost no inexpensive drone being manufactured anymore that you can use with flight planning apps. So there still is one or two, but it's a very fragile situation, which I would compare to our situation 1 year ago with the satellite imagery, where there's one company, Maxar, that we're completely dependent on. In terms of drones, we're completely dependent on 1 or 2 manufacturers who could pull the plug on us at any time. So we need more open drone hardware. And fortunately, that's a fun thing to do. And we're working on that. Flight planning. So there are 3 apps that are sort of most commonly used for deploying a drone to collect imagery. One is called Drone Deploy. One is called Pix4D Capture, and one is called Litchi. All of these are paid apps. You have to pay for them. So you don't have to just buy your drone. You've also got to pay for this third-party application. And they don't work with very many drones, especially now that the manufacturers like DJI are starting to shut down their compatibility with these applications. And they're missing features. If you want to create great 3D imagery, you need to be able to do, as I demonstrated, those multiple angles. Seeing the sides of those buildings like I showed you and seeing the underneath that bridge like I showed you, you can't do that unless your drone flies and takes multiple camera angles at the same time. So I did that actually with fixed 4D capture, but I literally had to fly the drone twice over the same area. Once a single grid looking down, and then once a double grid with the camera looking out at 45 degrees. So it would go out and back, getting, you know, north and south angles, and then sideways getting the east and west angles. So you're essentially overflying the same area 3 times in 2 separate flights just to get one great 3D image. Well, there's actually no reason for that to have to be the case. There's no reason why these, you know, flight planning applications couldn't actually implement multiple angle photos from each spot. And some of the professional applications for the very expensive drones actually do that. So that's a software development challenge. So those of you who, you know, maybe can't make drones, there's actually some work to be done on making flight planning apps. And we've actually just been in conversation with a consultancy in Belgium, and we're working with my great friends in Nepal, Naxa, to actually develop a flight planning app. And that's just in its absolute infancy. It's much, much less far along than, say, the Field Mapping Tasking Manager. But we are going to be doing some preliminary work on this in the Caribbean next year, starting in January. So imagine flight planning apps that allow anybody who can get their hands on an inexpensive consumer drone to actually generate this high quality multi-angle imagery. But we need permission. I can't see you in the crowd, but I'll ask everyone who lives in a country where they are allowed to fly a drone anytime they want, raise their hand. So please, everyone who lives in a country where they're allowed to fly a drone with no hassle, minimal regulations, raise your hands. And can somebody in the room tell me how many hands are raised?
One.
I live in one. Okay, my goodness. All right. Okay, who let me ask the opposite question then. Who lives in a country where flying a drone requires really difficult permissions, lots of time, lots of money? Even if you have a drone, you can't fly it until you jump through a bunch of hoops and pay a lot of money. Can people raise their hands if it's actually, again, the question is, even if you have a drone, is it still difficult and expensive to be allowed to fly? Please raise your hand. And someone tell me how many hands are up.
Ivan, there's a few hands in the online audience, and a comment from Ayo saying drone licenses in Nigeria take 3 years to get.
3 years. Wow. You might be the actual winner, other than South Africa, where I think you basically just can't fly at all. Amazing. So is this sensible for these countries? I mean, most of the countries that we work in say we don't want foreigners to have all of the economic opportunities. If we're going to do drone activities, we don't want somebody to fly in from Switzerland and stay at the Hyatt Regency to do this work. We want local people to be able to do the work. And when the regulations are such that it takes you 3 years to get a drone license, when the regulations are such that it costs $2,000 to get an individual drone license, operator's license, when it costs, you know, thousands of dollars to register each drone, when every, you know, in a country where I'm working right now, where every time you fly, you have to get individual permission for that flight and pay $70 US just to do that flight. Is that really favoring their own local population, or is that actually favoring large foreign consultancies who come in and snap up all the World Bank work and leave local people standing at the sidelines? So I really believe that we have to do a better job of advocating to governments to create sensible regulations which are in their stated interest. It's in the stated interest of the Nigerian government. The Nigerian people have the economic opportunities in their country, and when they make it expensive and time-consuming to get a license, what they're effectively doing is shutting out their own people from the work in their own country. Flight coordination. Again, sure, yeah, I can fly over that bridge in Indonesia, or we can fly over the Open Map Development Tanzania office in Dar es Salaam and create a beautiful image. But if I have one kind of drone and Pete has another kind of drone and Sam has another kind of drone, how are we going to actually create imagery that's consistent? How do we make sure that the pixel resolution is the same, what we call the ground sampling distance? That image that I showed you, we had what's called a 5 centimeter GSD, meaning every pixel in the image is approximately 5 centimeters on the ground. Well, now, how can you do that if you're each flying individually with different drones and your own application on your phone and no coordination? Well, guess what we need here? Tasking manager. You may be detecting a theme in what I'm saying here when I say that it's the hot tasking manager that's allowed us to remote map a great deal of the world. It's the field mapping tasking manager that I hope is going to allow us to finally answer that. It is high time for those attributes to be on there. And it's the drone tasking manager that's going to allow many people with many drones to be able to coordinate their efforts to make sure that, well, I've flown this area, so you fly that area, and your flight plans can be right next to mine, so there's no gaps in between them. And that's how we can actually create the underlying base data. Remember from my 5-layer cake, that lowest layer, that sensor data about the world that we use to build everything else upon, we need to be able to create that consistently. So that's what the drone tasking manager that we're hopefully just beginning to work on is going to be. And now feedback and processing. Okay, so you've been able to fly a drone. Do you have a Pix4D license, which costs thousands of dollars on your computer? Do you have a copy of Open Drone Map, which is free, but you got to know how to use it? Do you even know if the photos you've taken will be processed into a good quality image or not? You won't even find out until long after you're out of the area. So something else we need if we're going to create this kind of high quality imagery is feedback. When you fly, you need to be able to know fairly quickly, yep, it's good. You've covered that area. It's similar to the validation when you're doing remote mapping. Yep, it's good. You can move on. Your square is done. And processing. Why would you want to fly a drone if there's not going to be some useful information that comes out of it? So, people need to be able to fly their mission, push their data, find out if it's good, and then see the resulting map. And again, I'll just pull back here. When you see a thing like this, is there any question whether or not you did your flight correctly? No, it speaks for itself. This is properly done. Storage and serving. So I actually worked out based on just an ortho photo, not even talking about 3D. If you wanted to take the entire surface area of Africa and cover it with drone imagery stored on hard drives, that would be about 3,000 terabytes of hard drive space, which sounds preposterous. I mean, my laptop has 1 terabyte of hard drive space on it, and I can buy a 4 terabyte hard drive for a couple of $100s. So 3,000 terabytes seems kind of outrageous. But it's actually, for an endeavor on the scale, it's not. 3,000 terabytes of hard drives is maybe 15 or 20,000 US dollars. That's the size of a fairly small tech project, quite a small tech project, actually. If you were to store it on the cloud, I worked out it would actually cost about $12,000 a month, which again, that's a lot of money, but at the scale of like having an entire continent of proper high quality imagery. And so, some of you may have heard of something called Open Aerial Map, which is a project where if you already know how to fly a drone, and you already know how to process, and you already know how to create your end products and share them, you can upload to Open Aerial Map and then people can download it. So if anybody wants to go to openaerialmap.org, and I think probably the pride of place would be Monrovia in Liberia, where we did a bunch of drone flying. And so if you look at Liberia, if you want to do some digitization in Liberia, and I hope you do, and I hope you want to do some field mapping in Liberia and Monrovia, you've actually got some really high quality 5 centimeter drone imagery, which is free on Open Aerial Map, which we did in about 2019. And that's on Open Aerial Map, but Open Aerial Map right now would, it would fall over like an antelope shot with an elephant gun if you tried to put all of Africa on it. So, we would need to do a lot more work to get it to the point where it could be a genuinely serious replacement for the satellite layers. So yeah, communities can use small, cheap drones. We can do that in what I think is, and I hope you think too, is incredible imagery that I showed you, but we need more tools. We need more stuff. Okay. So now I'd like to move to my, the sort of the key bit of my presentation here, the field mapping tasking manager. So that's at FMTM.hotosm.org. Here's the URL for that. And with a bit of luck, I'm going to flip over to that and show you in a moment. But for now, I've got a slide, which I'm just going to show you. I'll explain the idea of the FMTM. So those of you who have been to tasks.hotosm.org, the hot tasking manager, you're familiar with this idea that you log in on your laptop or your desktop, and you see a grid of squares. And in that grid of squares, you're going to choose one. And when you've chosen one, it's going to tell you can open Geosm, and now you can digitize all of the whatever you're supposed to digitize in there. Maybe it's roads, maybe it's buildings, maybe it's water bodies. Well, for field mapping, actually, can I get a show of hands again, and somebody tell me how many hands are up? How many of you have gone out in the field with Kobo Toolbox or Open Data Kit or EveryDoor or something like that to actually do field mapping, to actually add attributes to buildings or streets or something and out there in the world? Show of hands, and somebody give me a rough count, please.
Seven.
Okay.
And a few online.
Okay. Slender contingent, but definitely non-zero. Okay, so you probably know some of the challenges there when you're out in the field trying to map. Not least the one that I talked about, that it's not always obvious what the attributes or what the structures you're trying to do are. But if you're more than a handful of people, it's actually quite complicated to know who's done what and what's been completed yet. And of course, if you think of extending the idea of the standard hot tasking manager to field mapping, would a square make sense? Would you want to have a task where one of your, some of your buildings are on one side of the river and some are on the other side, or some are on each side of a busy freeway? So in fact, it's not squares that you want. And there's a further complexity that we discovered when we did our field tests with the field mapping tasking manager, which is that with the tasking manager for remote mapping, it's pretty much always the case that you have a one-to-one correspondence between your task and your person. There's never really any good reason for one person to check out two squares in the tasking manager. Similarly, there's never any really good reason for two people to be working in the same square. Well, field mapping is not like that. Our very first test, which is in the Caribbean, in the little country Dominica, which was very successful. It was wonderfully promising. But nevertheless, we discovered immediately that 18 people go on a bus up to Culebistri in northern Dominica, and everyone gets their task that they're going, their little neighborhood that they're responsible for, and somebody finishes right away. Okay, fine, they get the next task. Well, now they complete that one. Now there's actually, one person who's got nothing and another person nearby who's only halfway through their task. So naturally, the person who's finished their first two tasks wants to jump in with somebody else. So you actually, very quickly wind up with a reason why two people would in fact want to be in the same task. Another thing that we encountered, and this was in Rwanda, was when people were offline. It was a rural area. It was a flood affected area, and people, didn't have internet access while they were, or not reliable internet access while they were out in the field. So they needed to be able to store up more than one task. If you're going out to map a bunch of flood affected buildings in northern Rwanda, you're out of reliable cell network, you don't want to finish your task and then have to like go back to town to get another task. So people needed to load up multiple tasks before they could go. So in other words, there's this added natural complexity of field mapping where with a remote mapping task, there's no reason to have anything other than one person in one square at one time. Whereas with field mapping, there's often a reason for one person to have one square, one person to have multiple squares, or one task to have multiple people in it. Okay, so what we've done is to leverage, again, Open Data Kit and Kobo Toolbox, which is a derivative of Open Data Kit. That's our Geosm. That's the thing that people are actually using. People know this one. You open it up. It gives you fields that you can fill out. Gives you a nice clear survey. You can design your survey in Excel. It's outstanding application. But those of you who haven't used Open Data Kit recently or haven't been following it, you'll note that there's a new feature called Select from Map. So if you look at the upper right of this image, you can see that there's a there's a square with a bunch of little red building footprints within it, and this is actually something that you can do on your phone. So Open Data Kit allows you to add a map file, a GeoJSON or a CSV file with a bunch of actual what they call entities, buildings or whatever, and you can click on one, and it'll that into the survey actually adds the OSM ID or the ID of that particular building. So how did we build this? We basically set it up so that you can have a set of tasks. You can go into the FMTM on your phone, and you can select a QR code. Now, what I do if I'm using my computer is I just scan the QR code using my phone. And we've got a button there, which is go to ODK, which doesn't work yet because ODK actually doesn't have a way of launching with a specific project configured, except with a QR code. So what you actually have to do right now is you have to go to the Field Mapping Testing Manager website, select a task, download the QR code, and import it into ODK. I'll go over that in a minute. So that's what it looks like when you're actually using the Field Mapping Tasking Manager, when you're actually on your phone and you're gonna select a task. When you've selected the task, it gives you a QR code, and then you can jump over into Open Data Kit. So I'll try to do what I had planned to do with you this afternoon was go outside and use some high precision, low cost GNSS material. We're going to do some super high precision surveying, which is a really fun thing. And we were going to do some FMTM mapping in person. And I don't know if it's going to work very well to do this remotely, but hopefully I can just give you just a little look at what it looks like. But right now I want to do a pause for questions. And then we'll wrap up the session by trying to take a little deeper look at the Field Mapping Testing Manager. So any questions, comments, suggestions, ideas, criticism, or love letters? Over. Pete, Sam, anything?
Nothing in the chat yet.
Okay. Anybody in the room have any thoughts?
Oh, we do have one in the chat. What about street views, 360-degree georeference pictures to see the sides and fronts of buildings?
Very useful. Yeah. No, that's incredibly useful. When I did, earlier on when I talked about, let me just pull up here, the very beginning here, I talked about sensory info from the world. So if you look at panel 1 here, we have on the right side of panel 1, we have aerial data and we have ground data. And then ground data, I would say that's 360-degree ground cameras and mobile phone imagery. So yeah, the way we typically think of those kinds of images, which, by the way, if they're properly georeferenced, they allow you to extract a lot of interesting detail. So, you know, if we look over on the right of this slide, that restaurant, we probably could have made a pretty good guess at what type of cuisine it was serving from this photograph. So if you had 360-degree imagery that allow you to see it, in some cases, you know, you might even be able to see, you know, the menu in the window. But yeah, what we typically think of is, first it was Google Street View, and those are basically photospheres. You've got a camera that's mounted on a vehicle. It's going around the world, and it's taking these 360-degree images, which get processed not into an actual 3D reconstruction, but into a series of what are called photospheres. So if you think about the way, you know, that imagery that I showed you, where you're kind of tilting, that's a different animal. That's an actual 3D reconstruction. That's an actual what we call digital twin of an area. Whereas if you think, you know, in Google Street View, and of course Mapillary is the more community-based one, where people are out there collecting imagery and sending it into Mapillary. You're constrained to one spot. It's as if you're standing in one spot, and then you can teleport to the next spot, and from that spot you can look around in any direction you like, and you can zoom, but you can't actually move freely and unconstrained within that space. It's still useful. And so my dream is that we would be taking that same kind of activity that people are doing for Mapillary or Google Street View, which is to say, moving around either with a 360 GoPro or a 360 cam of some kind, or even just a fisheye action cam. And even we've had some pretty good results just with the mobile phone camera. It's quite a bit slower, but if you do a good job going down a street with a mobile phone camera and taking a, you know, spinning around in a circle and doing a series of panoramas, you can generate, sure, street view type imagery. But from this kind of imagery, either from the 360 cams or from the cell phones, you can actually generate 3D reconstructions. You don't have the roof, but you have the sides of the buildings, and you have it in genuine 3D, and you can move around in that virtual space. An even more exciting thing that you can do, and that we're just on the edge of being able to do technologically, is you can mix that kind of ground-based imagery with drone imagery. Now, traditional drone imagery, you can't do that. Why? Because a traditional drone is just pointing straight down. Again, the main sort of secret sauce here for our drone imagery is that we're not just pointing the camera straight down. We're flying once with the camera pointing straight down, and then we're flying again with the camera pointing at 45 degrees. Now, that means when you have the camera pointing essentially at 90 degrees, which is what, of course, you're doing when you're on the ground, you're looking straight sideways. If you only have straight down and straight sideways, you can't mix them. They won't process into a single coherent image or coherent reconstruction. But if you have those intermediate 45-degree photos, which again comes back to having the right flight control and the right drones, you can actually mix them. So to your question, yes, absolutely, ground-based cameras are a critical piece of the puzzle. Those photospheres that you get, Mapillary or 3D Street or Street View style, are valuable and could add a lot more data to the map. But I think where the future is ultimately going to be is what we call digital twins, where you've got a full 3D reconstruction and it looks just a little bit like this, but with even more detail on the sides. So you could actually zoom all the way down and sort of, look, hopefully not in the window for privacy reasons, but you could kind of look at, the side of the building and see things like address numbers and that sort of thing. Right. Any more questions in the chat or in the room? Otherwise, we'll jump to the FMTM.
There is one in the chat. Is task boundary creation very time consuming in FMTM, ensuring tasks don't cross boundaries like rivers or walls or roads?
Actually, okay, so the first part of that answer is yes, it's time consuming, but it's automated. So we've actually developed an algorithm using, if you're a geo nerd like me, it's using PostGIS. So we're using a Postgres database, and we're using the PostGIS geographical extension, which specifically we had to do to make sure it was sufficiently high performance. If we had just done this with PyQGIS or something, it would have been way too slow. But you know what? The part about not making it cross roads or rivers is actually really easy. You can actually, I mean, even with QGIS, you can take an area, you can take any area of interest, download all of the OSM lines, which is to say you download the roads, the railways, and the line watercourses. And then there's a function in the QGIS processing toolbox called polygonize. Hit the button and boom, it'll chop everything up by roads, rivers, and railways, which is what I would normally select. So that bit is actually easy and not time consuming at all. We've built that into the back end of the field mapping tasking manager. It just does it automatically. The tricky part is that if you do that, you actually wind up with wildly disparate task sizes. So you'll have, some little areas where, if you use all the lines from OSM in the downtown core, you're going to have, quite dense roads. So you'll have things with maybe, 5 or 10 buildings cut off by roads. And you'll have in peri-urban areas, I mean, in Monrovia, actually, in Liberia, if you cut Monrovia up using just sort of naive OSM lines, your smallest task is 1 building, and your largest task is 900. Well, that's no good. So the actual time-consuming part is where we've created a thing that takes all of the tasks, counts the number of features within them, and then it tells you, okay, there's how many buildings would you like, or how many features would you like per task? And if you say 10, then it finds every area that's surrounded by roads or rivers and railways or whatever that's got more than 10, and it clusters those buildings and turns them into individual tasks. And I can show you what that actually looks like. So this is a real task in Cameroon, and this is actually not for buildings, this is for roads. So what we've done here is, this is a project, please confirm if you can see these, where we've actually created these individual polygons, which enclose a certain number of road segments. The polygons overlap one another a little bit, but it actually turns out that these polygons do properly enclose only the roads that they're supposed to, that each person is supposed to be working on. So this, by the way, is in Yaoundé. So this is not far from where you are, and this is a real project that we did. So there's a lot of data that's actually been entered in here. And there's a roughly similar number of road segments in each one of these tasks. Now, if I were to look at another one here, we have this one in Abidjan. And this is actually a building task. So yay, I'm still in Africa. I'm in West Africa here. Now you can see that there's areas that are that actually would have been cut off by roads, but there weren't enough buildings in them, so it glommed them together. And there's areas that are actually subdivided, where there isn't a road between them, but we've subdivided this anyway. So you can, you pick one of these, and this is what it looks like, by the way, when you choose it. This looks nicer when you're on your phone, but what you get here is you pick one task. You can see all the buildings that are within it. Those are the buildings you're going to be using. And if you open Data Kit and you configure Open Data Kit with this QR code here, or if you're on your phone, you download the QR code and you import it into Open Data Kit, you're actually going to see a project where, when you start new form, the first question you'll get is, select area. And the select area will actually bring you to, you'll see your location, the GPS location of yourself, and you'll see all of these little building footprints. And you can click on any one of these building footprints and add, fill out the rest of the form for it. Now, the sad thing here is that, very quickly we discovered that these building footprints aren't very accurate. So the ones that you actually see here, we redigitized because the ones that were already in OSM were really terrible. And we did them again with the highest resolution and most recent satellite imagery we could get. Even then, it still wasn't very good. So it was a real struggle to correlate the actual buildings one to another. And so it was actually, this is in fact the project that led us to realize we really need to review our digitization and our imagery. But yeah, to your question of splitting up areas, it's time consuming for a machine. But when we did our first experiments before we actually wrote the task splitting algorithm, our very first field mapping tasking manager project, I personally spent 2 days splitting up an area into individual tasks for people. That's totally unsustainable. So what used to take me 2 days now takes the machine about 2 minutes. Now, of course, if you're creating a project in the field mapping tasking manager, you click the create tasks and the thing starts spinning for 2 minutes. That actually seems like a long time. But again, it's something that used to take me, individually by myself 2 days to do. Very little time yet. So if there's any questions, please have at them. In the meantime, I'm just going to show you a little bit how we do project creation. And this should give you some idea of how you would approach creating a field mapping tasking manager project. I hope there's people in the audience who would like to do this. So I'm going to go create new project here. And somebody maybe just shout out if it's if you can see me. I'm going to go, this is project name. I'm going to go SOTM 2023. I'm going to go FMTM test SOTM. And my longer description is going to be testing field mapping tasking in Yaoundé. Sorry about the accent, it's not in there. Here I would put my credentials for the ODK server. So don't worry, if you're just a normal user, then we'll supply these for you, an ODK server. But as at the moment, I'm using my own testing server, so that's something I do myself. Okay, so there you go. Here's your basic details of creating a project, and I would go next. Now we have, what did I do wrong? Oh yeah, organization hot. Yeah. Okay. Next. All right. Now, no, I'm not going to enter my password. Let's go to Cameroon. No, fortunately, Cameroon is really easy to zoom into because it's right at the bend in West Africa here. Let's zoom into Yaoundé. And unless I miss my guess, you are all around here. Is this the right area? I'll take that silence as confirmation. Do let.
No, we're out west from Bamako.
Ah, okay.
It's kind of
well,
a satellite city out to the west of Yaoundé.
Okay. I won't take the extra time it would take to find you perfectly. Sorry about that. I sure wish I was there with you. Oh my gosh. But okay, let's take this little area of Yaoundé. So what we do now, you have the option to upload a GeoJSON file, which is your task area. But alternately, we've provided a way to just draw it. So let's say I just want to map this little neighborhood here. So up to the river, and as soon as there, now I've got an area of interest. Look at that. Tells me how big it is, so that's a bit less than a square kilometer. Incidentally, this area, as I look at it, this would take me about a half a day to fly with my drone to give you the kind of imagery that I showed you in Tanzania. Just FYI, imagine that you really wanted to seriously map this little area. Whatever time you're going to spend field mapping, you could have brilliant, super high resolution 3D drone imagery in about a half a day with a $700 drone. Okay, just say it. Next. Okay, select form. So now, if those of you who know how to do Open Data Kit, you know how to create your own forms. So you have an upload a custom form here. You can select an XLS form, which is anybody who's used Gobo Toolbox or ODK knows how that's done. In this case, I would just use the standard buildings form that we've pre-built, and our own Rob Savoy from the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team has created a whole library of basic forms you can use for the field mapping testing manager. This is a basic building form. What's the address? What's the material? How many levels? All that basic stuff. And I would go next. And then here I'm going to actually choose, do I want to use the buildings that are on EOS OSM? Since I've chosen buildings, it's going to use building footprints. If I click OSM, I can choose either centroid points for those buildings or polygons. If I want to upload my own buildings, I can create them in QGIS or whatever, digitize them however I like, and create them. Next, select an option to split the task. If I use divide on square and I say 50-meter squares, then I'll get something like that. Or, yeah, something like that. And if I use the task splitting algorithm and say I want, I don't know, 10 buildings per task, that might take a little bit of time. Yeah, we'll see. But we're out of time anyway. So I'll stop for questions while that spinner goes. Any questions online or in the audience in the last minute or so we have left? Oh, look at that. Isn't that nice? So there's a bunch of individually split tasks which contain approximately 10 buildings each. Haha, I'm so happy that worked live. And well, there's your answer to how time consuming is it? Not too bad. If you did that for a whole city, you'd be sitting there for a long time. But for a little area, it's pretty good. Okay, I am out of time. Any questions?
Yeah, one here, Ivan.
Yeah, my question is, the creating of project now, is it based on individual or is an organization that can create a project?
I mean, if you're an individual and you want to create a project, we can hook you up. Well, okay, first of all, if you're an individual and you're really technically inclined, you can spin up your own instance of the field mapping tasking manager. It's all completely open source. So github.com, HotOSM, FMTM, you could do your own, no problem. And there's instructions on how to set this up. That, however, would require that you be extremely technically inclined. If you're an OSM community and you want to use this, just send us a message and we'll hook you up. If you're an individual and you've got a good use case, of course we'll help you. We're still in fairly early stages of this. My intention is that, by the middle of next year, anyone will be able to do this in the same way that anyone who wants can just, get an ODK account and go ahead and do that. The short answer is, sure, yeah, as an individual you can. The long answer is it kind of depends what you're doing, how technically inclined you are. If you're not very technically inclined, but you've got a really good use case and something that we want to support, then we'll help you. Otherwise, if you're doing, I don't know, if you're doing like oil and gas exploration or something, then we're probably not going to try to help you as a humanitarian organization, but you're perfectly welcome to download the code and set it up yourself. Over. I think we're probably right out of time here, but anybody else have anything? OSM DRC would like to request an account for project creation, just contact me. Absolutely.
No more questions here, Ivan. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you. And I'm really, really, really sad that I couldn't be there in person with you. I really wanted to go outside and do this with you. But I really hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I wish you all a wonderful in-person meeting, and just be a little bit sad that I'm not there. Mostly be happy, but just a little bit sad that I miss you.
Nice. Cool.
Someone can ask if they can.
If they can hear, I'll check.
Okay, I think we are going to kick off the next round of sessions. Because we have 1 hour, and that 1 hour we're going to have 3 very interesting sessions, amazing speakers, and the first one will be meeting with FAO in Somalia. So we're going to be hearing about Somalia Water and Information Management System or project, Swalim. So I've been hearing the word Swalim the whole of this week, and I didn't know what it means. So this is a good opportunity to learn more about Swalim. And then after that, we shall get another presentation from the Haiti team, and that will be Meet the Sketchmap too. So get ready for that. So just stay here for the next 1 hour. All of those wonderful sessions. And then finally, we'll have the data quality internship, which will be presented by Rebecca. So I think we'll give it over to Michael. Please welcome to the stage for the first presentation. Thank you.
Thank you again this afternoon. It was a wonderful morning. I will be very quick. The presentation is very long. So as you have already seen, that is a unit in FL, Somalia Water and is a project. Next. So those are the thematic areas that we work around. Mostly focus around water resources, land resources, and we are very, very strong in remote sensing and GIS. And we share this information with actors, both within internally in FAO and externally, around various themes, including the disaster that we were speaking about in the morning. Next. So from 2001 to present, you see the way we have journeyed, and we continue to journey that direction. Continue. So that is just the location where we operate. We are in Somalia. Offices in Nairobi, Mogadishu, and Addis and Cairo. And that is information that is about what we do. And mostly we are doing a lot of capacity development for the government of Somalia, the staff in the government of Somalia in terms of building capacity to be able to use these mapping tools to manage their natural resource data. Continue. So that's how we are structured in terms of who we are engaging with in Somalia, and mostly these are government institutions across states, includes academic institutions as well. Proceed. So we want to look at each theme and a preview of what we do. So continue. That is water resources early warning. So as I was speaking in the morning, you realize that the whole of Somalia, Swahili, Swahili has been able to install high-point stations across the whole Somalia in terms of monitoring the weather and also river levels. So as you can see, we have 96 manual rain gauges, 4 synoptic stations, 7 river gauges, and 11 automatic river stations. All these to receive data on daily basis. So this is we are meeting the ground. Now this one supplements what we were getting from open source satellite weather information. Continue. That is also groundwater monitoring, installing boreholes so they can be able to monitor the groundwater. And this is, as you know, this helps in terms of understanding sustainable solution towards pollution water in Somalia and also for livestock and people. Continue. Yeah, so I will dwell a bit around this early warning action because of the recent work we have done in collaboration with OSM, and that's why I will dwell there a bit. So as we indicated in the morning, that early warning, early action, that is our mandate of operation in terms of responding to disaster, and in this case, for example, is just reaching the peak in Somalia, and we start from month to month, as you know, the process of prediction, using the data that we know, that is weather information, to make a prediction that is going to rain in the next 2 days or this March, and this one can cause flood, can cause this amount of disruption. Continue. Yeah, so we received a warning. We received a warning from WMO about and then it triggers internal action where now we activate our SOPs in terms of now early warning, producing of products, and to be able to inform action in Somalia. Proceed. Yeah, so we just, as I was talking about SOPs, so that's just a bit of demo. And we are saying that early warning system, as you already know, should timely, accurate, and valuable information. So, and it should be as accurate as possible to avoid also miscommunication because you are committing disaster to the public, to a bigger audience. So that's what we ensure while doing that. Proceed. Yeah, so before even the SOPs, the early warning and the weather forecasting happening, earlier, before the season even begins, there is an analysis we do before the river project. We study the 2 rivers, Shabelle and Juba in Somalia, and using very high resolution satellite images to find out where it has broken, where it's likely to flood. So this information, after studying all these rivers, we share now with the actors saying, okay, please respond to close this at the Somali government, and also internally resilience and social protection unit to use this information to go to close, put a sandbag along the river courses, markments, in order to mitigate possible or reduce the effect of flood when it happens. So this is one of the data sets that GIS was sensitive to this one produces to support that early enough before the rainy season. Continue. Yeah, so so this is another data set that we produce now in collaboration with OSM. As you can see, we map buildings and roads, and this is the result. Actually, we added almost 800,000 buildings, and we thank you guys for that kind of support. And this data set is one out that we also use to produce data sets such as high ground for evacuation, and also predict potential impact of investment happens, so that people can allocate resources as early as possible. And that's what we call anticipatory action. So that is an example of the 3 areas where we, 3 of the 5 areas where we produce the diagrams. These are risk areas in Somalia. That's the way we have Johan, and then we have Baderi. So those the green portions are higher ground areas, potential higher ground for evacuation. It's the flood happens, and the blue part is the forecasted flood from Lofas, the Copernicus project. So we combine various factors to come up with this data set. We are looking at the extent of forecasted flood. We are looking at the elevation using the open source FMTM. We do that. We are looking at accessibility of those areas. We are also looking at the drainage network, because we want to set up, we want advise what where the water is going in case of a lot of chemical. And then we also looked at the limitation level. When we want to take people in the wilderness, and here now the OSM data play a role in terms of we want to take people where other people are sitting, so that it's easier to integrate them those during that time of the time. So we go back to the time. So that's part of proceed. So so these are the products that we disseminate around the early warning. So you can see seasonal outlook, river breaks that we have already shown with the info forecast. Then we have flood alerts and advisories. We have the radio and SMS, the season performance. So you see at the season performance level, we are looking at post and how the season will go. So that can help us plan ahead when such a disaster is. But also, as I mentioned, we look at the drought situation in Somalia, and we have built an index. We call the combined drought index that takes consideration precipitation, soil moisture, and precipitation, soil moisture, and temperature. We go to determine which are the places that are receiving a lot of impact of drought, and that set guides now the intervention in terms of maybe cash transfer to those people that have been affected, livestock inputs in those areas. Proceed. And so these are some of the products, and you can see I put it there so that you see what GIS, how GIS is playing a role. So all that is the very focus data. This is the river levels. So we have the long term, we have the mean, and then we have the current river levels. And there, I think someone was talking about triggers. So we have levels, we have studied over time the historical river level. We know that in the Eritrea or Johan, when it reaches a certain point, it's a risk. So you send an alert. If it goes to Bangkok, then you tell people evacuate because the flood is coming. And it's interesting because most of the flood will begin from the Ethiopia side, in the watershed, and so the flood level keeps going downwards towards the Indian Ocean. So in 1 week, in 5 days, in so days, we are going to, that's going to reach the level. So please go to higher level. Proceed. So so that's how we respond in terms of the audience, the target audience for that message. First is government, because it has a full mandate to around people, government of Somalia. Then the development partner now who come in to support and implementing partners, and now lastly the affected community. But you have to look at it from this side, because these are frontline. These are those people who are being affected. We do a lot of this process. Proceed. And then how do we deliver those that information? One is through mailing lists, social media, online channel, and lastly, radio and SMS. To reach that person who cannot afford an internet but can listen to either in the radio or in the neighborhood. Okay, proceed. Proceed. Okay, so just to demonstrate, that's the image of one of the times that flat or flat. That's how you see all the buildings are underwater. So how do we interpret that information? So you look at this on the side map, you will see actually there are numbers down there. So one of the contribution there is the buildings that we get on the OSM and also roads. So we can say, okay, this number of kilometers of road are underwater, and this is the building underwater. And the building part plays a role to in terms of population, to imply population, because in Somalia we don't have that population as village level. It's just at this level. So we are trying to find a way of showing actually what is the impact in terms of number of roofs so can do that of the impact. On top of that, we are looking at the agricultural city, like agricultural land. If it's flooded, then it will have an impact on the livelihoods and the food system. So I don't have this information to help responders to allocate enough resources or not enough resources.
This meeting is being recorded.
Manage the resources properly to put yourself towards needed more to be able to allocate that, to build resilience and then find a community that will help them adapt after the disaster period. Continue. Yeah, so under the theme of water, we have mapped all the water sources across Somalia, and we keep updating that data set when funds are available. We have captured boreholes, all the boreholes in Somalia. We captured the dams, bunkers, all and almost four categories of water sources across Somalia. And this information is important. We are talking about livestock and also people. Continue. So we also do specialized studies. This is one of the studies that was done some time back. That's looking at the ground hydrology, that is amplitude there in the proceed. Then look at land resources, proceed. So land cover, as we mentioned before, that's what we do. And land cover also involves specifically agricultural market. And we have projects that are just towards this, and they are around the issue of building community resilience. So we are marking riverine areas and finding how much is agricultural land, how can this be translated into how far are we going to take it in terms of production of then we look at land degradation because that's our area. We know the importance of that already. But if we study land degradation and we work with intervention to reduce thermal soil erosion, that means we are directly adding to our mandate as a FAO in terms of promotion of agri-food system. Soil is not destroyed, but people can be able to grow crops. Continue. Proceed. Yeah, and then we also study soil. We have done 1 to 25A scale soil of Somalia. So this one goes without saying that it plays into the food security issue because we will do suitability, crop suitability analysis each crop in the whole Somalia. So we know that in this region, sesame will do well. Basically, maize would be a banana would be here. So computer 2.